This particular lesson I've entitled Bass Chord Strumming. It has the country bluegrass sound. It's very important as a guitar player, whether you intend to play those styles or not, that you get well versed in this. And really, it's great music, so you should be open-minded to all kinds of music. Let's start with an E chord. Your bass note is the root of the chord, right? This low E. We're going to go with a simple rhythm of 1, 2, and 3, 4, and. That should be old news at this point. What I want you to concentrate on is only playing the bass note on beats 1 and 3 and the top 3 strings as your chord. Make sure that you have this and gradually work it up to speed. Now, I could make a video where you play along with me and I play the exercise at a very slow tempo and a little faster, a little faster, a little faster. But if this is the first time you bought one of my videos, I guess you might have expected that. But for all you guys and girls out there that have bought my videos before, you know I'm not like that. That's up to you. That's your woodshedding that you have to do. But set that metronome at a slow tempo and never play any faster than you can play cleanly. I mean, you can get ragged, but don't go crazy to where you're just practicing mistakes. So this will always be down, down, up, down, down, up. Let's learn a little theory here. The root of a chord is simply the letter name of the chord. It's the root of the scale from which that chord was built. If we have an E chord, it's the first, third, and fifth notes out of an E major scale, okay? So the fifth note would be this B note. Now, whether or not you know how to play that scale doesn't matter, because you're going to learn these notes in reference to the fingering. Anytime you play an E minor, or an E seventh, or an E minor seventh, or an E sus4, any kind of E chord that's in this position, the root is the sixth string open. The fifth of the chord would be the second fret of the fifth string, this B note. That's going to be our alternate bass note. Okay, so now you're going to put that on beat 3. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and. This requires a lot of skill on your picking hand. You don't need to look at your left hand. Watch your picking hand. There it is with an E minor. You hear how you get the little bass line zipping in and out there, and I actually changed. I wasn't just playing roots and fifths. That's just to whet your appetite of where this can take you. All right, so any kind of E chord down there, here's your root, here's your fifth. Well, you also have another root over here. So let's go back to our first passage. And instead of striking the low E on both the first and the third beat, you're only going to play it on the first beat and go over and play the octave E. Now you see why I wanted you to just play the top 3 strings for your chord. Think of all the different variations. You could have a 1 measure variation. See, I go root, fifth, root, octave. I'll slow down a little bit. I know I'm playing these kind of quickly. If you're a beginner, here's your root. Here's the fifth. Here's the octave. Just set yourself a rule that if you're playing a 2-bar phrase, which means 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4, and, the first beat of the first measure will always be this low E. That's home bass. Then you can play around with the root and the fifth that exist up above, or even restriking that low root. So a lot of variations there. This is a great way for you to practice developing muscle memory for the chords. If you're just getting started, it'll get you focusing on your picking, which most people tend to neglect. You just sit there and hold that E chord and work on this. It'll keep you from flying all over the place, so there's a lot of good stuff there. There I have applied a palm mute, right? there I applied some fretting hand staccato. So you see you can develop this later on, do a lot of different things. Let's move over to our A chords. If we had an A chord right here, the fifth string open is the root of our chord, obviously, right? We have one root and two fifths, second fret of the fourth string and the sixth string open. So you might go. Now that can get a little rumbly because you end up having that root and that fifth ringing together. So be careful. It's a little trick that I'm doing. When I go back to the root after striking that low sixth string open, I come in and lightly mute the sixth string to get it out of the way. Hear that? Hear me just mute that out? I'll do it again. Or if I just strike the sixth string, you'll hear it. Practice that little exercise. Strike the sixth string, come in, and mute at the same time that you place the pick against the fifth string. Then you have this fifth up here, so you could go. A lot of variations on that. And the same thing, A minor. So you see what I'm doing there? I'm just playing a couple of chords, but I've got this bluegrass thing going on with the picking. It's great for your hands. How about a D chord? The root of the chord would be the fourth string open. The fifth of the chord will be the fifth string open. Do you notice what I'm doing now? I went 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1. Because what we were playing was a quarter, 2/8, a quarter, and 2/8. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4, and... It sounds a little wrong if you constantly keep the eighth notes going. If you go 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1. It's good to put a little space in. Minor. And then that's why you use unused fingers. You know, if you play a D minor, you might say, well, I'd rather play a D minor with my third finger instead of my fourth. Well, then you're in trouble because you don't have as much ease getting over the bass. See how you could start applying a scale for a bass line underneath the chord. If you know your scales, this will be an easy task for you. Just plot it out in that position or think about the notes, okay? So that was for your Ds, D minor, D7. There's an example of an Allman Brothers tune where you're playing, okay, a couple. You might refinger the D chord so it frees up a finger. So a lot of things you can do that fall into this bass chord strumming technique. Well, that takes care of all your E's, your A's, and your D's. If you're playing a G chord, you probably hated this chord when you first learned it, or if you're just a beginner, you're saying, I can't ever get that fifth string clear. Well, I'm going to give you a break today. Pick up your second finger. You don't need that note today for what we're going to do because your root is the sixth string, third fret, because that's a G note. The fifth of the chord will be the fourth string open. There's another thing I'm doing here. You notice even when I go, when I play those eighth notes, I'm not trying to hit a lot of strings because I get more texture and more air and it's just technically more practical. Okay, so that would be for a G. Let's look at a C chord. On a C chord, the root of the chord is that third fret, fifth string. Ring finger right there, right? The fifth of the chord would be the G down below. You could hold the C chord like this, but it can get a little rumbly. Depends what you're after. Okay? And then you have other chords. For example, if you were playing a B7, a general rule, and this is pretty easy to follow. You just saw it with the C chord. If the root of your chord is on the 5th string, the 5th of the chord will always be in the same fret over on the 6th string. It's very important. So even if you're playing a bar chord, it's root 5th, root 5th. Very important. If the root of the chord is on the lower string, and this is a standard rule, for example, when you had an E chord, that's open, right? So it's a 0. The 5th of the chord was in the 2nd fret of the 5th string, so it's always a 2-fret interval there. If you were playing a bar chord, there's root and 5th. So memorize those two shapes. They hold true on any of your bass strings because all the 6th and 5th, 5th and 4th, 4th and 3rd strings are all tuned 5 frets apart, so these patterns will remain consistent. That's real important. Later on, there I'm playing a capo D fingering, right? It's an E chord. This is sort of advanced if you're a beginner. But the point is, I know that's root 5th, root 5th. I don't have to think about it. It's right there. Okay? Well, we've talked about the root and the 5th and covered if the chord was rooted on the 6th, 5th, or 4th strings. But you have another note in the chord that you could use. It could be the 3rd if it's a major chord or a dominant chord. And it could be the flatted 3rd if it's a minor chord. Let's go back and revisit. That's a bluesy thing. I'll show you that in just a second. Let's just go with an E chord. You're probably saying, I don't like that. Okay, we'll skip that. That would be the 3rd of an E chord, that G sharp out there. But what if it was an E minor? What you have now is an arpeggio. The root, the flatted 3rd of the chord, the 5th of the chord, and then the root again. Hear it? Sounds like something a piano would play. So do you see how you can get these bass lines coming right out of the arpeggios? That same pattern would hold true if we had an A minor. Right? Let's say you were playing a C chord. You have a 3rd, which is the E note. Now, if you don't know how to figure out what notes are in a chord, let's say you don't know your scales, you don't know your theory, well, you should be able to figure out what notes you're playing over here. So let's just say you're a beginner and you've learned this C chord and you have a chart of the names of the notes on the guitar. By plotting it out and locating notes, you would determine that this is a C, this is an E, this is a G, and then there's another C and another E. How many different notes are there? A C, an E, and a G. Now, if you know your alphabet, you know what notes come, what letters come when, right? So if C is the root of the chord, C, D, E, F, G. They're always going to be every other note, right? If it's a major chord, if it's a minor chord, they're every other note. All right, so the root is right there. You say, well, where else do I have a C? Well, you don't have one down low. The closest C is over there, so that's not a bass line, is it? Then the 3rd of the chord would be the E. Well, you'd have an E here, you'd have an E here, right? You'd have that in your little chart. Then the G would be right here, because you're not going to look at the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd strings as bass notes, not normally. Maybe for, if you're on a D chord and you want the 5th up above, there's your pattern again, that 2-fret pattern. So, but let's say we're going. Notice my unorthodox fingering. I'm holding the C chord and then I reach around with a cross finger and use my 4th. All those extra things, we're going to talk about that in just a second. That's what sounds great in the bluegrass. And you're getting into the 16th notes with that without having to pick them. They're called slurs. Okay, so if you had the arpeggio, you could figure out what notes. Let's try that with a G chord. Here's your G chord that you get out of your diagram. You're a beginner. You look at your diagram of your notes, you say, okay, there's a G, and there's a B, and there's a D. So those are all the notes in the chord. There are only going to be 3 because these are triads. Now, if you're going to incorporate that B on that G chord, you really got to arch that 3rd finger and get it upright so you're not muting the 5th string. Don't worry about that the first few months you're playing. You can skip it and just play a G chord like that because you still got that B note over there, so it's still a complete G chord. The G5s that I've given you don't have that B note. They don't have the 3rd note of the scale in them. That's a power chord, just root and 5th. So there's your theory lesson. Okay, so I just said that we're going to talk about those little slurs in there. One way to look at this is to think of it as the slurs replacing a strum. When we talked about 16th notes, we said they were 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a, right? And that's at a slow tempo. If we were playing a middle-of-the-road tempo, 1 and a 2 E and a 3 and a 4 E and a 1. Those would be the 16th notes, right? Let's look at and count it as quarter notes and 8th notes. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4. I'm holding a G5. If you tried to pick those, it'd be very awkward. It wouldn't feel right. You know, it just wouldn't sound right, so you simply use hammer-ons and pull-offs. We're going to talk about hammer-ons. If you're a beginning guitar player, a hammer-on means an ascending slur on the same string in which you strike the lower pitch note, which would be as far to the left. So if it's an open string, you can't go any farther than that. And then you drop a finger down. Let's apply that to a chord. Here's a C chord. You pick the 4th string open, then you drop your 2nd finger down. 1, 2, and 3 E and a 1. 1, 2 E and a 3 and a 4. Real slow. Bass note, then you're down up on your treble. And normally you go 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4, and, but we're going to throw an extra note. You got to practice getting your chops together on that. The pull-off is when you pull the string to the next highest pitched string, which would be close to the ground. That's a combination of hammer-ons and pull-offs. That's one of the fastest ways to get your muscle memory together. And also, all the bluegrass licks, you see, you don't pick them. You got your strum going, you're putting in all these other things. Those little things that you're throwing in with your fretting hand are hammer-ons and pull-offs. We'll get to that in just a minute with your sus2 and sus4 moves again. But that's using these slurs to incorporate the next level, the 16th note. Or if you just want to make it as an 8th note, 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1. Okay? That's something to work with. I suggest you go and look at your diagrams, and you were presented with your sus2 and sus4 moves, right? Where you have, for example, a D chord, a D sus4, a D sus2, D is home bass. So I'm changing on the beat. I'm going 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and... But you know that if you put a kick in, you play it on the and. So we're going to push the chord change. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and... So we're back to accents or kicks. But you can also eliminate a stroke. Let's say I wanted to go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and or if you're counting 16ths, 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and. But I I simply delete the stroke and hammer on my finger. You see what that does? It opens up the texture a little bit. Then the pull off would take me from the D sus4 back to the D. Likewise. Now, something like that is crowded for me because I've talked about how my fingers are really flat and wide on the bottom. Going from D to D sus2 with a pull-off or a hammer-on is quite crowded for me. I would love to have a 1 3/4 inch nut, you know, wider fingerboard. Really, like a classical guitar is 2 inches, so I'm in pretty good shape there. Because then when you have to turn your hand to get that clear. So it might not be advantageous for you to try it in all of its positions, but do this with any chord. And I've talked about this in the past. I don't know if I'm going to go into it right now. I'll give you some food for thought. Maybe I'll just present this quickly. I'm not going to diagram anything out. But when I showed you all these chords that were in the key of G, you had G or G5, right? It was the 1 chord, A minor 7, A minor, all those, A7 sus4, A minor 7 11. That was a 2 chord. And then you had B minor, which was a 3 chord, but we substituted a G over B to make it easier for you. C add 9 was a 4 chord, D was a 5 chord, and E minor was a 6 chord. If you're a beginner, you probably don't understand how these chords get extended, how we can play a C or a C add 9 that still works. Well, it's because we're never venturing outside of the key. Key of G, for example, the notes would be G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, then it starts over in the second octave, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. What I do with my students is I teach them to scale, then I say take a chord out of the key. If I'm taking the A minor, for example, that's my 2 chord. Then string by string, I'll always have the same notes available. On the first string, I'll always have G, F sharp, E, right? So I might go. I now have some melody that I can play in there, these little variations of the chord instead of just parking on 1 chord. I can strum those notes. I can hammer them on, I can pull them off, I can slide them. And then I apply that same principle to each string. On the second string, the notes will be B, C, and D. So I'll tell you what I will do. I will give you the diagram of this scale, and then I'll plot it out over each chord. I'll make the red notes of the chord, arpeggio, and then the black notes will be the remaining 4 notes in the scale, because the chords come out with 3 notes, root, third, fifth. Then you're going to have the other notes. And then I suggest you just try these techniques with your rhythms, and you'll enhance your rhythm playing tremendously. So if I'm on... I'm in the key of G. I'm on my A minor chord, which is a 2 chord. There's my G scale. But we're playing it over the 2 chord A minor, so it's called A Dorian. But there's just a little improvisation using these chords out of the key of G. Everything's coming out of that scale. Obviously, you got to have your technique together to keep this all together, right? But that's something for you to work on. So there's an example of slurs replacing strums. It's a great way for you to get accents on your chords. Look how easy that is. Here's your E minor chord. That's the 6th chord in the key of G. The open D is in the key of G. The open A is in the key of G. So you could go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4. Have some fun with this. Chords coming out of the scale, so the scale is your source for all the extra notes for bass lines, melodies, chord extension, all that stuff.